Welcome to All Things Financial, where we help you retire once so that you can retire well. Trey Peterson and Yelisey Coots, Season 2, Episode 55. And today we're going to talk about redefining success after age 60. What does the psychology of winning look like in this season of your life? Come join us for a great episode on winning after age 60. Welcome to All Things Financial, Trey Peterson and
Yelisey Coots.
And I'm really excited. Today is episode 55, season 2 of All Things Financial, where we help you retire once so you can retire well. And today's topic is redefining success after age 60. And another way to say it would be the psychology of winning, really, as you prepare and walk into retirement. One of the things I love about our podcast is we want to help you maximize what you've worked so hard for. And today we've got 4 or 5 steps to redefining success past age 60.
Well, I think the first one that we wanted to talk about is identity and purpose. And I think probably all of us can relate at some level, but I remember even at a very young age, having ideas on what I wanted to do. And people ask you all throughout your life, your adolescence, even in your teenage years, what are you going to be? What are you going to do? But my mom shares this story. She says, when I was 3 years old, I used to tell her that I wanted to be a doctor, a police officer, or the guy who cleans up the snow.
You've done none of those things.
I've done none of those things, but it was just funny. It's like doctor, police officer, the guy who shovels snow. And, we're so wrapped up in that part of our identity. And I think that, it's really difficult to disentangle yourself from that. And I think that never really ends. I mean, what are your thoughts when you were a kid? What did you want to be, or how much of that was tied up into who you were?
Yeah, I think, when we talk about identity and purpose, I think most of the time when you talk to a young kid, especially, both of you and I our thing in school was sports, right? So for me, it was football, wrestling, and rugby. And so I think a lot of, young people, their dream is to be a professional athlete because they admire, they look up to, and they respect these, professional athletes. I think from an early age, with having parents that did ministry work, I was early introduced to business, and I had uncles that were successful and they had things that we didn't have. So I guess for me, it wasn't the celebrity because I didn't know any celebrity athletes. It was being like one of my uncles so that I could afford golf carts and dirt bikes and four-wheelers. But I guess for me is I wanted to be successful, right? I think everybody wants to be successful. And that term, if we say the word success, means something different to me today than it did back then. I think as you have life experiences, as you grow, the way that somebody would define success can change. One of my favorite, most recent definitions of success is success over age 60 is when your adult kids still want to spend time with you. That's success. I think success is when you retire and you're not wondering if you're going to be okay. You have all the pieces in play. You know you're going to be okay. It's not about, is the money going to last? Now it's about, how do we best steward this money? So when we talk about identity and purpose, I think most people, I think even statistically, maybe even more men, find their purpose and identity in work.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we want to talk about is, how do you find your identity when you retire and work is no longer who you are?
Yeah. Who will you be when you're no longer what you were for all of those years? And, and maybe you disagree, but I think too much self-worth is tied up in what we are, what we do for work.
Yeah, for sure.
Much of that.
But I think it's, it's in every movie that you watch, it's like, what does your dad do? You see they've got show and tell days, and you've got dads that show up to share what they do. And some dads are cooler than other dads because of what they do. But I would say that one of the best pieces of advice that we could give people is not to reinvent your life after retirement, but to decide like who you are unrelated to work before you retire.
Yeah. And I think that it's kind of a startling thing for a lot of people when they finally do retire. You don't have to wake up at 9 a.m. or 7 a.m. or whatever that time was for the last 20 or 30 years. No one's waiting on your email. Nobody needs you anymore. And I think it is very unsettling, and it's a difficult transition for a lot of people. In fact, there was a Swiss study that looked at people from the age of 58 to 70 who had already retired, and the vast majority of those people still introduced themselves by what they did. So imagine, Bill, an engineer, is at a party and he's still introducing himself as an engineer, but he's been retired for 10 years. It's still such a huge part of our identities.
Yeah.
And I think it's almost, it's obviously he's not doing it because he misses what he did. He's just so wrapped up in that identity.
I think it starts to, we talk about success over age 60 and the psychology of it. One of the things that's been interesting to me as a wealth manager over the last 12 years is watching strong men that their success in retirement is tied to how they start the retirement. So what I would say by that is I've seen so many guys that they go, I'm going to retire at 65, and they get to choose the day. They get to choose the date. They get to finish out the project that they were last on. And if they get to finish the way that they decided, they have an amazing retirement oftentimes. They're happy. They knew the date. It was planned years ahead. Where I see a lot of people fall off, where I would say go from knowing their identity to having years of what I would call is like kind of having a broken heart, is where they decide they're going to retire at 65. And at 63 in 3 months, they get a layoff letter that says, we no longer need you. And it doesn't even matter if they have all the retirement assets, if they've got all their income, if their wife carries their benefits and they don't need help with benefits. Even if everything is taken care of, I watch strong men struggle because they didn't get to decide when their last day was. And one of the things that I've told, dozens of men that I've watched through this is I've said to them, you have two options. You can decide that this wasn't chosen for you, that your last 2 years were taken from you, and you can spend the next couple years, basically pouting about it. Or you can decide, hey, there must be a God up there that wants me to have more free time, or there's something better for me to finish out my career the next 2 years. And so I would say that perspective is everything. They say that success is not what happens to you, but it's how you respond to it.
Right.
And I think that's a great example that no matter what happens in your life, you have to respond well. And so the psychology of being successful in your 60s, I would say, doesn't start when you retire. It starts before retirement. So you already know who you are. You know how you're going to spend your time. You find some hobbies, things that you're passionate about, and you serve.
I actually think there's a great analogy looking at your identity like a table. And during your working years, one leg that represents all of the work has a lot of weight on it. But eventually that leg gets removed. And now you have the other three legs. And if you're not prepared for that, if you haven't built up certain things in place, like maybe hobbies or things that you're interested in, or some of the other things that you were talking about, then those three other legs will not be able to support you. So you have to be prepared for that. And I think it's just a great way to look at it. When you retire, that leg will get pulled out from under you. What are you going to do? How have you prepared for that transition? And I think some people naturally they don't have a problem with it. They're already volunteering. They already have purpose outside of their work. Maybe, but some people really struggle too. So
when we talk about structure without a schedule, one of the things our business coach, Keith Kraft, often says is that you don't have to have this schedule where you do the same thing at the same time every day. You might be a person like me where you prefer a rhythm. And I've always lived my life that way, meaning that even if I do things often at the same time every day, if I miss it in the morning, I'll do it in the evening. And so the reason I share that is that you can be successful without a work schedule. But one of the things is you need to find out, am I more of a rhythm person or a schedule person? If you are a schedule person, one of the things I would encourage people to do is almost practice retirement. What does that mean? That before retiring, what about using some of those vacation days to say, I'm going to take a week and I'm going to schedule the things I'm going to do in retirement to see if I like those things. Because one of the common denominators I've found of those that we serve that are the happiest is that they didn't wait until they were retired to find out what they wanted to do next. They found it earlier on.
Yeah.
We're talking with a client of ours, won't give his last name, we'll just call him Mark. And one of his big hobbies is that every week he builds beds for kids that don't have beds. And not only is he now building the beds and actually delivering them and seeing the result of it, he's recruiting people to build beds, to deliver beds. And one of the things that he told us is that he gets more satisfaction building beds and delivering them to kids that have never had a bed. They slept on the floor or just a mattress on the floor. And he said he gets more satisfaction out of that than he did in his career. And I thought, how rare is it that we meet people that have more satisfaction in retirement doing a hobby or serving or volunteering than they did collecting a paycheck?
It reminds me of a guy that we've met several times over the years. He's not a client of ours, but somebody that we've actually helped, and we've been happy to help because of what he's doing.
The bicycles?
Yeah, the bicycles. I don't know how you do that. Yeah. So, so this guy was a math teacher, and he happened to, for what he was paid during his career, he happened to accumulate much more than many people. People would love to have what he has. Let me just say that.
Millions of dollars
being a math teacher. And what he does now is he helps prepare tax returns for people in his neighborhood just for free. He helps seniors. I think he said like dozens of returns every year. People just come to him and they keep sending him referrals. He's not a CPA. He's just helping people. And on top of that, he helps to rebuild and restore bicycles so that they can donate those to people who need bicycles. And like they're bringing in tens of thousands of dollars each year because he's funding this on his own. He's promoting it. He's fundraising. And it's incredible that he managed to do that after retirement. And by the way, he found his career very fulfilling too, right? As most teachers do. Teachers they're not in it for the money typically. So it's just amazing that he was able to do that.
Yeah. And I think about the people that are the happiest. They have a purpose. They found their next thing. And one of the things, it's kind of like when you talk to somebody that's preparing for retirement, it's kind of like talking to a 20-something. So I hear so many 25, 30-year-olds, they'll message me on social media and they'll say, hey, I'm depressed. I hate my job. I don't find purpose here. I'm not doing what I'm called to do. And I'll say, well, how many different jobs have you had? And they'll say, well, one, or this is my second. And I'll say, well, the chances that you find your thing right away are pretty slim. The key is to knock on doors. And so, I was telling someone the other day, my first 7 years out of college, I worked at 6 different companies. All of them were financial services, but, different arenas, different size companies. And so it's not even just about finding your industry. It's about finding the company culture that you want to be a part of. And I would say that retirement's that way, meaning that you should go knock on doors. So if you find that building beds and delivering them to kids doesn't do anything for you, that's okay. Maybe working at another organization that serves, a humane society is like helping rescue dogs. That might be your thing. Maybe what you need to do is work at a company that packs food for kids that don't have food. Maybe that's your thing. Maybe it's serving at church and setting up chairs when nobody else wants to do that, but you find great purpose in that because you love the church. That's your thing. So what I would encourage people is, talk to 8 or 10 friends of yours or 2 or 3 friends, depending on how many friends you have, and find out what are others doing and go try it. You might not like it. You might find that you love something that you never would have tried before. But I would say don't be scared to knock on doors and find something that you see the result of it. See the result of building the bed. See the result of packing, the food for the homeless kid. Find out what gives you purpose.
Yeah. You know who doesn't have this problem? People who can't retire, right? They're not wondering about their purpose and identity. And unfortunately, we see that too. So, the alternative, sometimes we look at, life and we think it's kind of bleak, or sometimes we get, in retirement, it's kind of a well-known fact that retirees tend to be depressed in some cases, right? But when you look at the alternative, and unfortunately, we see the alternative, people who can't retire that have to continue working, like you have it good. So I think retirement for a lot of people doesn't have to be this daunting thing where they're worried about it, but it can be an invitation, like you said, to rediscover some of these things that maybe you don't even know you're passionate about them, but you can find something in retirement that brings you the same meaning that you did while you were working.
What's interesting is we meet with a lot of people that they end up going back to work, kind of like you said, not because they want to, but because they have to. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is I do think life is so much about psychology and perspective. So imagine this. I sit down with a couple. They've got $1 million for retirement. They're spending $8,000 a month. So after Social Security, maybe they need to pull $5,000 from investments. And because their money ends up lasting well into their 90s, they're not worried about going back to work, but they choose to go to work. Oftentimes, that person or that couple is happy to go to work and collect an extra paycheck because not only do they love the work and being around people, I'm somebody that has to be around people, but now if they're making $1,500 or $2,000 a month, that's $1,500 or $2,000 a month. They're not pulling off their investments. And so they love the fact that they're getting paid to do something that they would probably do for free anyways. Well, then you have another couple, same expenses, but half the retirement assets. Maybe they had a second marriage, so they had a restart on their finances. Maybe they had several career changes where they spent 3-4 times that they were out of work for 6, 12, or 18 months, and they had to go into the 401k. What's interesting is if that person, they have the same expenses, $8,000 a month, they need $5,000 from the portfolio, but they've got $500,000 to support it. Now they're forced to go to work. I've seen where those people end up hating it because they have to be there instead of the couple that's there just because they want to be. Yeah. So one of the things I would say is, if you've been through something difficult, whether it's a divorce or you started saving late or you started a business and it wasn't successful and it took a part of your nest egg, I would encourage you almost to pretend that you don't have to go to work in your late 60s or 70s, Just decide that even if you had the money, you would go anyways, because it may make it easier and you might enjoy it even more. Yeah. The reason I say that is I think a lot of life is just the things that we tell ourselves. And so what's interesting, again, is watching all these families that we serve that work part-time, but they're going to leave millions of dollars to the next generation. And they're happy to work because they know they're leaving money behind. And then you watch people that they don't have enough, so they have to work, and they regret going to work in their 60s every day. And so I would say just decide that even if you had the money, you're going to work part-time or more because you want to be around people and you need a purpose.
Yeah. One of the exercises that we talked about doing is, having everybody just pause for a moment and think about how they would identify themselves, how they would communicate that to somebody else if they couldn't use work as part of the description.
Yeah.
So if you had to do that right now on the spot, I don't know if you've given it any thought. You probably have no problem describing that because of how many things that you're doing outside of work and just the things that, through the church and everything like that. But I think it's a very difficult exercise for most people. I know it would be for me.
Yeah, I think that I heard this said once, and I think it's really good. I heard somebody say, never attach yourself to a company or an industry. Instead, attach yourself to a mission. And so I think one of the things I've done is, even though my primary time is spent in wealth management, I also do leadership and coaching, and then I'm involved in my church doing ministry. I don't see the wealth management, the leadership and coaching, or the ministry as different things. I see it as a mission of helping develop and helping other people be successful in life. And so what I would say is, if your identity is tied to 3M, or it's tied to General Mills, or it's tied to being an engineer or a wealth manager or a leadership and coaching consultant, change your identity from a title to a purpose. Because if your identity is in a mission, it doesn't matter what the vehicle is as long as you're getting that mission done. So whether you're an engineer or you're in sales or you're a school teacher, if your mission is to empower other people to live better lives, you can do that even when you retire, just in a different vehicle. So I would say is attach your life to a mission, not to a job title, and then be creative in how you continue to make that mission happen no matter what you're doing with your hours.
Yeah, and one of the things when you were talking about so much of life being a matter of perspective, kind of reminded me when I was like scolding the kids for, they had their fingers were dirty from eating and they're putting it on the glass, and I was like, hey guys, wash your hands, you're leaving fingerprints on the glass, don't touch the glass. And my mom, she was like, hey, there's going to come a time where you're going to miss seeing those fingerprints. And for me, that kind of struck me. I'm just like, hey, I'm a little OCD I hate this stuff. I like cleanliness. And it's kind of the same way at work. We talk to a lot of people who have retired, and, prior to retirement, they would complain about their boss, or they would have certain things that maybe they didn't like, things about their job that were just annoying. And now they kind of miss, talking to other coworkers about some of the things that used to irritate them, and having,
right.
Because at work, in reality, what happens is you have an instant tribe. Those end up being the people that you interact with day in and day out. And when that's all gone, sometimes even the things that you thought you hated were the things you end up missing.
Well, here's what I would say is there's something called the Pareto principle. Are you familiar with that?
I don't think so.
So the Pareto principle is basically, it's called the rule of 80-20. So what they say is in every organization, 20% of your people produce 80% of the results. In your life, 20% of what you do at work produces 80% of the results. In a church, 20% of the people give 80% of the money, and the other 80% make up for 20%. 80% of the people only serve 20% of what's needed, but there's 20% of the church that actually is doing most of the volunteering and servicing. So what they found is that in almost everything, this 80-20 principle applies. So what I would say is, when you are married, one of the things that we tend to do, you and I have talked about it, is when you date somebody, a lot of times we end up dating and marrying our opposite. You look at the 20% that they have that you don't have, and you admire that. You can't believe it's different than you. It compliments you. You love that about them. And then you get married, and it's those same things that irritate you the most. So I would say that when you work with people, it's the same thing. You and I could agree on 80% of the same things, but instead of focusing on the 80, we could focus on the 20. And one of the things I think you have to do in a marriage or in a friendship or in a business is decide, I'm going to focus on the 80% that we agree on, and not the 20% that we're different.
Yeah.
So John Maxwell, in one of his books, in talking about psychology, one of the things that he talks about is that when a train is pulling compartments, a lot of times some of those compartments are refrigerated. And in the 90s, there was a gentleman that he had the night shift, and his job was to clean out these compartments. And while he was in the middle of cleaning a refrigerated compartment, everybody else had left. When he got done, he realized that he had locked himself in it. And he went to the door and he was hitting it as hard as he could. He was screaming as loud as he could. And what's interesting is that the door was locked. He couldn't get out. Mm-hmm. And so it hit him, though, that it was refrigerated at like below 40 degrees because it was a freezer. And basically, as he sat there for hours figuring out how to get out, he got colder and colder and colder. And he actually ended up sounds terrible, but he ended up cutting his finger, and in blood he wrote, "I love my wife, I love my kids, please let them know this was an accident." And in the morning, some coworkers showed up at 5 a.m. and they ended up finding him frozen to death. Body was as solid as it could be. And what was interesting is they found that this refrigerated freezer was actually not plugged in.
Yeah, the boxcar. The
boxcar was not plugged in. Yeah. And what they ended up finding out is that because he convinced himself that he was in a freezer, his body literally froze to death. And so what's interesting is, well, that sounds a little hokey. It's actually documented that he literally froze to death thinking that it was still attached. It was still plugged in. Yeah. So the reason I say that is, in retirement, have the perspective that even if I had all the assets, I would probably choose to work because it makes going to work easier every day.
It's all about perspective.
It is.
Speaking of structure without a schedule, one of the things that was interesting was there's a study that looked at 65-year-olds. 1 in 4 people, when they looked at the structure that people created for themselves, whether it was waking up and taking a morning walk at the same time every morning, going to the club at the same time every morning, they found that 1 in 4 people reported being measurably more happy in retirement who created a structure for themselves. Well, so I know that sometimes, when you lose your structure initially, that's awesome, right? You don't have to do some of those things. People are excited, but then sometimes the days start to blur. And how many times have we heard that, where it's like, hey, 6 Saturdays and a Sunday, they all kind of seem like they're blurring together and there really isn't that much distinction, and people seem like they're lost and without really any kind of sense of identity. So creating that structure for yourself, I think that's a great way to help transition things smoothly and maintain your happiness.
I think the other thing I've heard too is a lot of people think that a schedule is restrictive, but it's a schedule that gives you freedom.
Right, exactly.
Right. So create freedom by sticking to a schedule. You'll end up having more time than if you wake up and don't have a plan. All right. The loneliness paradox. Tell us about that.
But I think people just start to miss the noise, right? They miss the hallway chatter. They miss the things that, that really, maybe some things that they could say, hey, these are the stressors in my life today, but I don't think you look at them that way in the future when they're gone, right? Because it leaves sometimes an empty void. And I think that, that's what really the loneliness paradox is. And the other thing too is, in retirement, and this comes, we initially, when we first talked about doing this podcast, we thought about talking about the go-go years, the slow-go years, and then the no-go years. Yeah. And I think that, if we were to look at loneliness, later on in retirement, that's where we see it too, where folks are finally approaching the no-go years. And sometimes, it's because they've lost friends and family members, and sometimes they've lost spouses too. And really there isn't, when you're 60 and 70, you can get a part-time job, you can consult, you can do those things. A lot of those options, they kind of tend to run thin when you're in your 80s and 90s, right? So I think people feel even more so, they feel like maybe they're not needed as much. They can't attend all of the events, right, for their grandchildren. And maybe, especially if they've lost a spouse or a friend, sometimes it can be lonely.
The loneliness paradox reminds me of COVID, right?
Yeah.
So during COVID, one of the things that we saw is we'd see social media posts of grandparents that were hugging their kids through a garbage bag. Right. Or they were waving to their kids on the other side of the window because they didn't want to catch COVID because maybe they were in their 70s. But what's interesting is there's a lot of statistics specifically around loneliness and suicide. So when we look at 2020, 21, and 22, a lot of people who are single, living in apartments or houses by themselves, that were confined, we found that alcoholism was through the roof, drugs were through the roof, suicide was through the roof. And so one of the things that my mom, who's been in marriage and family counseling for more than 30 years, is she said, in marriage and family counseling, in the decades I've been doing this, she said, the number one thing that she says that causes people to make bad decisions is loneliness. She said, loneliness is dangerous, where we've seen One example, I've got a friend, he's a wealth manager just like you and I are, and he's had several single clients, males and females, that have given tens of thousands and even six figures to someone that they thought was a romantic relationship that they had only had computer access relationship. Emails, text messages, never had a phone call. And once the money was given, that person disappeared. Yeah. So one of the things I would say is that loneliness is really dangerous. And as you prepare for retirement, you need to design a schedule so that you're not lonely. Get around people, find your purpose, find a call so that you're not lonely in retirement, because what we want is we want your retirement days to be your best days. One of the things I think that we see that can be a real challenge for people is not when Jim and Julie retire at the same time. Yeah. It's when Julie retires and then 2 years, 3 years, 5 years later, Jim retires. And now Jim finds that Julie is already in a rhythm
and he's disrupting it. Yeah.
And not only does he feel left out because she's got cards with certain friends, she's playing tennis with certain friends, she's going to the knitting weekend convention in Phoenix, Arizona quarterly, but he comes in and he feels like I'm alone. And then what can happen is Julie feels like Jim is ruining her retirement. Yeah. And so one of the things that you should have a plan for is what are some hobbies that we do separately and what are some things that we do together so that your retirement drives you together and not apart.
You know, it's funny. We talked about doing a podcast, and occasionally whenever we're doing a topic, we run it by our clients. So we talked about doing thriving in retirement as a couple. And one of our clients said we should change that to surviving in retirement as a couple, because everyone talks about having a little bit more time at home. They don't realize it's a lot more time at home with each other. And whether you're disrupting the schedule that your spouse had, sometimes we've had, one spouse who hasn't been working, right? Maybe one spouse has been a stay-at-home mom or something like that, and then the other spouse retires, and it's a complete, you have to relearn how to live with each other. Mm-hmm. And, we had another client that compared that to when they first started out, right, in marriage and life, where you're kind of getting to know each other. You have that honeymoon phase, but then some of the things that you thought were really awesome and quirky and cool ended up being really, really annoying. Right. And it's kind of the same thing. In retirement, you find that, hey, you know what, we used to go our separate ways for 40 years, and now we're just together all the time.
Right. Well, according to Pew Research, 1 in 4 people that get divorced are over age 50, right?
Yeah. And that number has been growing.
It's been growing. So, one of the things that we want to help people do is retire once, retire well, not just with their finances, but with their life. So as we kind of wrap up our episode, what are 2 or 3 tips that you have for our listeners on how do they win after age 60 in retirement? And then I'll close with a couple myself.
Yeah, I would say, look at retirement as an invitation, right? Don't look at it as,
it's good.
And I think that you have to give yourself permission to grow. You have to look at it as this is a journey that we're on together. And really, if you do it correctly, I think it can be one of the most fulfilling seasons in life, because a lot of times, some people are really good at segmenting their life where they look at their work and they really kind of, like you said, it doesn't really identify them. And they do a great job already giving back to the community, getting involved in their church, getting involved in their grandparenting, right? But a lot of people don't do that. And I think that if you look at retirement as an invitation to really invest into those things, you're going to be more fulfilled than when you were working. You're going to have more time to do the things that you've always wanted to do. So I think that there's a couple of things. We've talked about this in the past, making sure that you take care of your body in a way that allows you to do those things, prioritizing your health, your fitness, your nutrition, those types of things, so that you can enjoy retirement and be the best grandparent you could possibly be, that you can give of your time and your resources and your talents in ways that maybe you didn't have the opportunity to when you had to work 40 hours a week.
Yeah.
And I really think it can be the best stage of your life.
Really good. I would say for me, most people spend more time in a year planning their 2 weeks of vacation than they spend planning their life. Yeah. What I would say is whether you're somebody that's always been a planner or you've never been a planner, or maybe you're married and you've always been a planner, but your spouse hasn't been interested and didn't want to be included, I would encourage you to set up a quarterly meeting with your spouse. My wife, Stephanie, and I do this, where we sit down and we say, what did we do well the last 3 months? What do we want to keep doing? What do we want to stop doing? And what do we want to start doing? And I would say that if you can set up a quarterly planning meeting with your spouse, and it can even be fun, right? I mean, do it over your favorite appetizers or drinks and sit down and go, let's throw it on the wall. Let's map this out. and then decide what are our hobbies that we're doing separately, what are we doing together. And I think if you can design or live by design instead of by default, you can have a great life. One of my favorite things in 12 years of, being a wealth manager is when clients of ours come in and we're able to help them have total financial peace, and they do the work to find their hobby or the part-time job or the consulting role, and they will literally say, I've never had more fun in my life than I'm having in retirement.
Yeah.
And I would say some of those keys are living by design, not by default. If you're married, having a plan with your spouse and knowing what you're doing that's having an impact on others. And then I would end with this. John Maxwell, who's, one of my favorite authors and speakers, he has a great question. And one of the things he says is, great leaders ask great questions. Average people ask good questions. But one of the questions he asks is, what am I doing for others? And so one of the things I would just end with is, what are you doing for others? And if you don't have a list of things or a couple specific things, find that so that you can maximize your retirement and succeed past age 60. Thank you for joining us today at All Things Financial, where we help you retire once so you can retire well. Episode 55, Season 2. Join us next week for our next one.
Advisory services are offered through CG Advisory Services, LLC, a registered investment advisor, and through Guardian Wealth Strategies, LLC, a registered investment advisor. CG Advisory Services, LLC, and Guardian Wealth Strategies, LLC, are separate and unaffiliated entities. The topics discussed on this podcast are for educational purposes only and are not intended to be investment advice or recommendations. Listeners should consult with their own financial professionals before making any investment decisions.